Wagner fighters storm the south of Avdiivka and the Russian forces advance in the north of Bakhmut. That and more as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Pisky direction to the west of Donetsk, where the Russian forces advanced here in the north of the city, while the Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack here in the central parts, advancing further and cutting off the connection between the city and the northern fields of the Pervomaisk area. We see here that there are many attempts by the Ukrainian forces to try to regain positions here in the central parts of the area between Pervomaisk and Pisky, as that would allow them to start operating here to the south of Vodiane. The Russian forces currently hold these positions to strengthen their positions here to the south of Vodiane and Opytne, allowing them to hold their operations in the northern parts. If the Ukrainian forces manage to cut off the Russian positions here in the southern parts, they'll be able to cut off the supplies going northwards towards Vodiane and thus pressure the Russian forces here in the north of the river line, pressuring them from multiple directions and allowing them to strangle the Russian capabilities to perform offensive operations here to the west of Avdiivka. We then move on to the southeastern parts of Avdiivka, where we here see this video which shows Wagner soldiers working with the Rosgvardia, part of the Russian army, conducting offensive operations here in the industrial sector in the southeastern parts of Avdiivka. This area here is completely riddled with a lot of trenches all over the place. We see some right here, as well as in the eastern parts. So everywhere here there are a lot of trenches, and it's an industrial zone, which means that the buildings are able to hold on to a lot of force. In this video we don't really see any units. We only see a lot of artillery fire between the two positions, as well as a result of direct tank fire on each other's positions. The Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting heavily in this industrial sector, and from this we see that there is this preparation prior to the assault, which was later on reported here in the southern parts. The indication is that the Wagner soldiers, who have a lot of experience fighting within Bakhmut, are now using that experience here in the southern parts of the Avdiivka area to try and gain an advantage here in the industrial zone. According to both Western intelligence and pro-Russian sources, we have seen that the Wagner forces have largely returned to the front line in the guise of the Rosgvardia of the Russian forces, and these are most likely under the command of Yevgeny Prigozhin's son. So with this we see that Wagner has returned and their focus is currently in the southeastern parts of Avdiivka, but we've also seen reports of them fighting here in the northern parts as well as in the southern parts north of Vodiane. In the northern parts, in the direction of Stepove, we also see the Wagner forces fighting within Stepove itself. We have this video here which was released by the Ukrainian forces. The video shows that the Russian forces are operating within the outskirts of Stepove. We have this bunker here within the outskirts of the village where Russian soldiers go into, as there's an artillery barrage by the Ukrainian forces on these positions. But it doesn't seem that any of them get hit because they take cover in the bunker. Then an infantry fighting vehicle comes up to shoot at the Russian positions, after which an FPV drone flies down and attacks and flies into the bunker, trying to attack the Russian soldiers within it. So we're seeing that there's this fight taking place here in the outskirts of Stepove. The fighting around Avdiivka is significantly increasing, as we see both to the south and to the north there are multiple fronts. In the northern parts there's the direction towards Stepove and the north of Krasnovarivka, where the Russian forces are defending their northern flank against Ukrainian incursions, and they are using their own forces to attack and storm Stepove here to the north of Avdiivka. We also see in the southern parts, in the eastern outskirts, that there is this storming against the industrial zone to the southeast of Avdiivka. With this, we see that the most fortified area of Avdiivka is being stormed directly head-on by Russian forces. With this, we see that the Ukrainian forces needs all hands on deck to be able to deal with all of these Russian forces attacking from all sides after the recent reinforcements arrived. At the same time, the weather is not optimal, as we are currently in the middle of November, which means that there's a lot of rain, the ground is muddy and so on, which makes it difficult for armored vehicles to be used, except on paved roads. With that, we see that most of the fighting has returned to the urban areas, as we see here in the direction of Pervomaiske, in the direction of Avdiivka and Stepove. With this, we see that the fighting is now in areas where both sides are able to concentrate their forces because the fields are very difficult to drive through, and as such, there's minimal need for actual defenders, as there's hardly any possibility of a real offensive taking place, at least a large-scale one in these areas. With that, based on the experience from last year, we see that there's going to be a lot more casualties from these artillery strikes and MLRS strikes, we'll say airstrikes and so on, as the people, the soldiers, are going to be more concentrated than they are in the summer or winter time, as in those periods the forces are much further spread out, which allows them to use other tactics that reduce the amount of casualties. So we are entering a stage in this war that will be highly attritional for both sides. Therefore, we are likely going to see whoever is able to mobilize the most forces and have been on rotation will gain a larger advantage. Because currently, as we see, the Ukrainian forces who were active in the offensive have now been rotated to defend Avdiivka, while the Russian forces have used fresh forces to launch this attack. With that, we see that there is this difference in how fresh the troops used are. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where here to the north of Klishivka, the Russian forces launched an attack capturing the outskirts of the forest lines. So we're likely going to see future attacks by the Russian forces here to the north of Klishivka, trying to recapture the fortifications here in the northwestern parts of Klishivka, together with attacks directly towards Klishivka, trying to recapture the village. And finally, the fortifications here to the west of Klishivka will also be a target to try and cut off the Ukrainian positions here by Avdiivka and in the southern parts by the canal. Moving on to the northern parts of Bakhmut, we see that the Russian forces have, over the past few weeks or so, managed to recapture parts of the Berhivka Reservoir, gaining full control over it, as well as the forest lines and patches here to the south of Yahidne. With this, they essentially have full control over the northern part of the front line. With this, there's going to be fighting over Homove as well as Bohdanivka in a similar situation to what we had during the operation where the Wagner forces captured Bakhmut. There is a few changes, like the Russian forces not having physically cut the road, the Ukrainian forces holding on to Homove, and no foothold within Bohdanivka. However, we're very close to what we saw on the 20th of May, which would mean that the Russian forces have mostly negated the gains in the northern flank by the Ukrainian forces during the counteroffensive. So with this, we see that there's going to be some fighting here in the southern parts, which is the main focus of the Battle of Bakhmut. If the Russian forces manage to recapture Klishivka, then they'll be able to have negated the whole Ukrainian offensive over the past 5 months in the Bakhmut direction. So this is a huge development. If the Russian forces are able to launch a large enough attack and gain success in this part, the Ukrainian forces' morale would severely diminish. But taking a look at all of this, we see that what my analysis says is that the Russian forces need to send a lot of troops, well, everywhere, both in the direction of Bakhmut, in the direction of Avdiivka, in the southern parts by Zaporizhia to hold the line there against the Ukrainian offensive operations, in the Kherson direction where the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks across the Dnieper River, which, by the way, if you haven't seen, there was a new Twitter offensive where the Ukrainians claimed they got a foothold, armored vehicles across, and got a large area, which clearly hasn't happened, not even according to Deep State map. So with that, it's just another Twitter offensive. But taking a look at all of the developing situations, the Russian forces still have a lot more forces in the Liman area than anywhere else on the front. That raises the question, does Russia simply have that many soldiers in excess, allowing them to have a lot of forces everywhere? Or is it that they're still planning something by Liman, despite their lack of usage of this 100,000 strong army in the north? At the same time, we have a lot of Russian forces on rotation, which raises the question, is it going to be a continuous thing where the Russian forces simply rotate a lot, or is it that they are preparing for another offensive from the northern parts? So there's a lot of questions being raised about what the Russian forces are actually using their own forces for, while at the same time we see that the Ukrainian forces repeatedly try to fill in the gaps of their ranks whenever the Russian forces start a new operation somewhere else, because it seems that the Russian forces are currently just trying to run down the Ukrainian forces by attacking at different areas. First, we saw the Ukrainian forces attacking by Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. Then we saw the Russian forces trying to pressure the Ukrainians in the north by the Kharkiv, Luhansk border. And then now we see them fighting Bakhmut and Avdiivka. We'll likely see them again attacking in the Kupiansk area, and then back again in the Bakhmut Avdiivka area, trying to go back and forth, pressuring the Ukrainian forces wherever they are showing any gaps or weaknesses. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.